name is Kevin Middlebrook. I'm professor of Latin American politics at the Institute of the Americas, University College London. It's my great pleasure to host this webinar on Mexico's fourth transformation and President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Our goal is really to offer some interim judgments and contribute to the ongoing public debate about contemporary Mexico and President López Obrador, or AMLO's, first 2 years in office. Before introducing our guest speakers, I'd like to remind everyone in our virtual audience to please keep your microphones and cameras muted during the presenters' presentations. That will help protect bandwidth, and we hope will make the event go smoothly in technological terms. We're really pleased to have with us today two distinguished analysts of Mexico, Alberto Olvera, a research professor at the Universidad Veracruzana in Mexico, and Laurence Whitehead, a senior research fellow at Nuffield College, University of Oxford. Both of them are internationally known for their research and writing on different aspects of Mexican politics, and no doubt we will cover quite a lot of terrain today. Following their presentations and some brief comments of my own, we'll have ample opportunity for question and answer about AMLO and the fourth transformation. Alberto, please welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I appreciate this invitation. It's an honor to share this event with you, with Laurence, who I consider my professor in many ways, and with Kevin, a long-time friend. In order to save unnecessary suffering to the audience, I will read some lines I wrote. My English will be bad anyway, but at least it will have some coherence. I hope so. So let me start immediately in order to save time. First of all, we have to understand that the overwhelming victory of López Obrador and his recently created personal party, the Movimiento de Regeneración Nacional, or Morena, in the elections of July 2018, was a result of a plebiscitarian election, which expressed the massive popular rejection of the inequality, exclusion, violence, and corruption that characterized the regime of the transition to democracy. López Obrador's merit was to symbolically embody both the opposition to the rapacious neoliberalism and the moral criticism of the generalized corruption of the political class that ruled the country in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. Despite his overwhelming victory, López Obrador faces severe limits to carry out his project. Most of them are internal to his coalition and to the project itself. Indeed, Morena is not a political party, and the ideas that guide the fourth transformation are basically outdated. The peculiar form of populism that López Obrador promotes is also out of touch with a complex and rebellious society. The historical conditions are the worst imaginable: a pandemic, a global economic crisis, a global dispute for the hegemony. However, in Mexico, there is a profound political transformation in the making, and we have to make sense of it. First, we have to understand that the transition to democracy created a fragile democratic regime, but the state remained basically the same: a fragmented, weak, corporatist, particularistic state. Democracy led to real electoral competition and to a certain degree of liberalization of the public space, but it never changed the deep legal, political, and cultural structures of the old regime. There was a pluralization of clientelism, a democratization of corruption, the growth of the bureaucratic apparatus, but under the same rules of the past. The entire process of democratization was therefore paradoxical. Moreover, the transition to democracy was carried side by side with the neoliberal transformation, and this simultaneity led ultimately to a general crisis of the political regime. Indeed, the fragmentation of power, the irrelevance of or plain inexistence of the rule of law, The generalized violence, the increasing dysfunctionality of the clientelistic and corporatist organizations led to an unavoidable outcome: the simultaneity of a crisis of legitimacy, a crisis of representation, and a crisis of stateness. This is of the state capacities. We cannot talk properly of an economic crisis, but in fact, the neoliberal project was basically a failure in terms of economic development. This general crisis meant the rupture of the legitimacy and efficacy of the methods and forms of relationship between citizens, political intermediaries, and state institutions created along a very conservative transition to democracy. The triumph of López Obrador meant the rebirth of a project that remained in a residual condition for 3 decades, the nationalist developmentalist. It returned with a populist personalist style that creates new risks to the precarious Mexican democracy. As in all populist projects, there is a leader that brings together an heterogeneous constituency, creates a common ground by means of symbols and demands, defines an enemy to be defeated, and brings a sense of mission to the new government. López Obrador maintains that his government constitutes the 4th transformation in the history of Mexico after the independence, the reform, and the revolution. But like most populisms, López Obrador's is ambiguous about regarding the meaning of his project. In this case, it is not a new beginning, but a recovery. AMLO thinks that the error of the neoliberal PRI was to betray the nationalist and etatist legacy of the original PRI's project, which synthesized the mission of the Mexican Revolution. So, the historical task now is to recover the sovereignty of the state against all de facto powers in order to guide the development of the country and to deliver social justice. In a sense, we are facing a kind of nostalgic populism, a desire to go back to an imagined utopic past. But in another sense, López Obrador is just intending to correct the excesses and failures of the neoliberal project. We will see very soon. In practice, in its first 2 years, the new government has been destroying the political foundations of the neoliberal regime, but it has not resolved the crisis of representation and opened the doors to its electoral victory. In the absence of autonomous social movements and of a strong civil society, López Obrador has had enough political room to replace some old practices of domination with others that are equally old, such as the cult of his personality and the reconstruction of absolute presidentialism. Therefore, the partial destruction of the past corporatist and clientelistic forms of popular control, and to a certain degree, the renegotiation of their relationships with national entrepreneurs, has not led to the development of more democratic state-society relations, but to the symbolic construction of a direct relationship between the leader and the people. Such relation is based on populist rhetoric, a polarizing discourse, an overwhelming presence of the president in the media and in the territory, and a slow but constant undermining of the division of powers. The speed of this change has been facilitated by the virtual vanishing of the opposition. The triumph of López Obrador and his Morena party occurred in all regions of the country, in all age groups, and in all socioeconomic strata. López Obrador won the presidential election in 31 of the 32 states, in 82% of the polls, in 92% of the electoral districts, and in 80% of the municipalities. Morena won 5 of the 9 governorships and 13 of the 24 state capitals that were in dispute, and the majority of deputies in 19 out of 32 local or state congresses. This congressional power has allowed the president to obtain the final validation of the constitutional reforms that he has managed to get approved in both houses of Congress. López Obrador created an electoral coalition that included openly opportunistic parties such as the Green Party, el Partido Verde, which has sold its support to all governments since 1994. the Partido del Trabajo, the Workers' Party, a strange melange of former Maoist activists and former pre-PAN and PRD politicians, and the Social Encounter Party, or Partido de Encuentro Social, a group of ultra-conservative evangelical pastors who decided to ally with AMLO, with López Obrador, when it became clear that he would be the winning candidate. This coalition obtained only 38% of the votes for congressional seats, which shows that the citizenship voted for López Obrador, who got 52% of the votes for president, but not for the parties that supported him. However, skillfully using the rules that the PRI created to grant itself with artificial majorities, the coalition obtained 52% of the seats in both chambers. This enormous parliamentary overrepresentation has allowed López Obrador to secure the votes to pass laws and budgets. Moreover, by making ad hoc alliances with some PRI's deputies and senators, he has even achieved qualified majorities that have allowed him to reform the Constitution, appoint 3 ministers of the Supreme Court, as well as change the composition of the regulatory agencies and of the Electoral Institute. The governors of the opposition parties, which had great power in the past, are now controlled because Morena holds the majority in 21 of the local congresses. Besides, fiscal centralism allows the federal government to administer almost 90% of the public budget. More than 30% of the public resources must be transferred to the states by law, but the federal government's ability to manage the pace and form of its delivery gives it a great discretionary power. So, López Obrador has started his government in an ideal condition for the president, which is a political vacuum, not only because of the defeat of the previously ruling parties, which are delegitimized, but also because of the absence of both a mobilized grassroots civil society and a pro-democratic elite civil society with political force. NGOs and think tanks have been very important in the immediate past, but López Obrador has managed to displace them from the political scene, accusing them of being an expression of elite economic groups like most of the media, against which he maintains a constant confrontation. Now, let's think about the problems of this project, and I would like to start by the absence of the true political party that supports the government. López Obrador built an electoral coalition that had neither ideological coherence nor real points in common, except the figure of the leader. The original Morena's foundational group was completely overwhelmed by the urgency of turning the party into a national political machine in just 2 years. The massive transfer of professional politicians from other parties to Morena led to a structural internal division in the party. On the other hand, the improvisation of candidacies led to the rise of a political class with scarce political and technical capacities. Paradoxically, the very weakness of the new ruling class facilitates the centralization of command in the leader president. But at the same time, the radical political emptiness of Morena creates both a problem of identity and one of effective leadership. Morena has no program nor ideology except those vague directions given by López Obrador in his daily press conferences. Moreover, given that López Obrador does not want to be the effective leader of Morena, the variegated tribes and political cliques that combine under the Morena umbrella keep fighting amongst themselves for posts and influence and for the control of the enormous amounts of public subsidies the party receives from the National Electoral Institute. Morena, as a party, contradicts the moral message that López Obrador postulates. Far from representing the emergence of a new political class, Morena is rather the synthesis of the old. This is what differentiates Morena out from the mass of Evo Morales, which really was a new party and helped to create a new political class, and from the Brazilian PT, the PT, which also formed a new political class over the years. Both parties had their origin in powerful social movements. Morena is mostly the recycling of a part of the old political class in a context of radical separation from social movements. Morena is rather an electoral apparatus similar to that of Kirchnerism, but without its grassroots organizational strength. The main difference between the past and the present lies in the personal figure of President López Obrador, who embodies a very different way of governing. It is the man who represents the change, not the institutions, not the project, not the party. This image reinforces the symbolic and political centrality of the president and focuses popular hopes on him. This strategy is compatible with the political culture derived from the old regime. Absolute presidentialism is in the DNA of the PRI. Now, how López Obrador is centralizing power, even without having a real political party at his service. López Obrador's main policy to centralize power has been the control of the governors. He has done this by creating a new position in the federal government, the federal delegates of social programs in the states, better known as superdelegates, who concentrate the management of federal public spending. The power of these officials is enormous because on average 85% of the resources of the states and municipalities come from federal transfers, that is, from money collected by the federal government. For this reason, the superdelegates have become parallel governors, since they not only control federal public spending in the states, but also assume a political role as coordinators of security policies and participates in decisions about the deployment of the National Guard, the new federal police. Besides, there are 285 regional delegates whose territory of responsibility coincides almost exactly with the 300 federal electoral districts. These officials manage the distribution of subsidies, take care of demands of conflicts, and also participate in regional security meetings. The superdelegate and the regional delegates have at their service 20,000 servants of the nations, servidores de la nación, officials in charge of collecting the data of people who will receive the new social programs aimed at young people, the elderly, and peasants. They also deliver the subsidies directly to the deserving people. Obviously, the political territorial role of the servidores de la nación is strategic for the government. Unfortunately, nobody knows the exact number and the names of the people that benefit from the new social programs, as the government has denied all the petitions to make public the information. The elimination of the previous social policy based on conditional and targeted cash transfers and its replacement by non-conditional but targeted cash transfers gives López Obrador a personalized symbolic power insofar as the servants of the nation deliver the money, explaining that it comes directly from the very president. Now, there is a second way of centralizing power, and given that I'm using a lot of time, I'm trying to reduce my discourse right now. I will say that one of the democratizing features of the new government has been the rejection of the old clientelistic organizations that served the PRI for many years. But this rejection of all kinds of intermediary bodies is affecting as well all types of civil society organizations, including human rights, feminist and ecological NGOs. Civil society has become a bad name insofar as it designates a politically independent social realm. All kinds of autonomous organizations are considered suspicious of collaboration with the old regime. Of course, this policy does not eliminate the existence of social networks, social movements, and all kinds of collectivities. The political attacks against civil society hurts the most the organizations that investigated the old regime's corrupt practices, denounced the violation of human rights and fought against the multiple forms of extractive capitalism. In a sense, López Obrador is indebted to them because the publicization of corruption, violence, and abuse was the main factor in the process of delegitimation of the neoliberal regime. In the meantime, the uncivil society, this is, the criminal groups, the mafia-style informal associations of taxi owners, street vendors, garbage collectors, money lenders, phantom business, etc., survive in the shadows waiting for better times. Given that there is currently no significant popular mobilization, the new government has not required to build specific mechanisms for the control of social movements. The government can resort to direct clientelism without mediation, since there is no threat to massive social mobilization. However, the government does not know how to deal with the emerging feminist movement, which does not operate on the logic and moral grammars of clientelism, nor can it dialogue with the indigenous movement, especially with the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, which has its own political autonomy and project, and neither can it be in good terms with the environmental movement, which resists the pharaonic mega projects promoted by the government. The colectivos de familiares de víctimas de desaparición forzada, the collectives of victims, felt betrayed by the lack of attention to their plight. The president promised justice, but the reform of the justice institutions is not in his priorities. López Obrador's weak flank is in the left-wing civil society. For those social actors, the nationalist developmentalist project means nothing but a return to the past. I would like to mention also the economic difficulties, the fiscal crisis, the impossibility to attend the problem of violence. As a matter of fact, violence has risen in these 2 years of government, but I'm taking too much time. So let me say only this. In political terms, the problem of the new regime is that it has no party and is rejecting alliances with existing social movements and creating a direct relationship with leader masses, which is not stable and is not a guarantee of an authentic social base for the new government. On the other hand, the decision to carry out the mega projects proper of a developmental state instead of instituting a policy for attending the sanitary emergence has led to a real collapse of the institutions of medicine and social medicine in Mexico. On the other hand, given that there is no anti-cyclical economic policy, the crisis will be more profound than in other countries. So this is not good for the health of the project. I think that the direction that this process is taking is quite dangerous, because it can lead, on the one hand, to the reinforcement of an populist authoritarian government, and on the other, to a populist temporary government that could open the door to an authentic democratization. But for this to happen, it will be necessary for society to mobilize and to organize autonomously in order to prevent the consolidation of authoritarianism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Alberto. You've laid a lot of things before us on what is a very complex and far-ranging subject. Laurence, please.
Yes, well, Alberto said many important things and opened the way to a whole range of questions, which I think need to be followed up one by one, and no doubt we should therefore make sure there's plenty of time for point-by-point discussion. I will try to be brief, and I will try to pick on 5 key items that appeared in Alberto's presentation, and which I think shape a lot of the discussion about Mexico. They're very broad and general. I won't go into the details. The first is the idea of a profound transformation, the cuarta transformación. The second is the idea of populism. The third is nostalgia for the past. The fourth is personalism. And the fifth is return to statism. That's, you might say, from a Financial Times editorial point of view, that's the bill of accusation against AMLO. And most of those points, although Alberto has been quite careful and nuanced in a lot of his presentations, his presentation can basically be fitted under those 5 headings of accusation against what is going on. I noticed that, for example, he referred to a peculiar form of populism, and he right at the end suggested that there were 2 alternative outcomes rather than a guaranteed route to consolidated authoritarianism. There was the possibility of the reopening of channels of democratization. So he himself is actually not quite so categorical as those big labels would suggest. But I want to press each of those labels a little bit. So if we take, first of all, cuarta transformación, well, it took at least a decade of extreme violence and upheaval for Mexico to even achieve its independence. It took at least a decade. Well, the Reforma under Juarez led to the French invasion and a terrible protracted war. Again, it was a transformation which was extremely violent and very protracted. And of course, the Mexican Revolution of 1910 resulted in the death of something like more than 10% of the population and a violent upheaval that lasted for a decade or more. So it seems a bit odd and a bit overambitious to me for AMLO to be claiming that what he's going to do is produce a 4th transformation of the same scale and importance as these 3 preceding ones. I think it would be more plausible to make comparisons perhaps with the Cardenas sexenio he might aspire to, or even the Echeverría sexenio of the 1970s, which would involve going back to the past. But notice then, I'm talking about a 6-year project, not a decade-long total transformation, but a 6-year presidency within a framework in which, I mean, from the very beginning, I've asked all my critics of López Obrador, do you believe he will still be the president in 2025? And on the whole, people say, no, he's going to be the president from 2018 to 2024, and that's long enough for us. Oh yes, sexennials are rather a long time, and an awful lot can happen in a sexennial. But they have a certain logic to them. And the crucial logic to the sexennial is you come in, you sweep aside all the uncompleted and failed projects of your predecessor. So you try to claim you recruit a new team of people. You try to claim all the hopes for the future. The previous sexennial failed, but I'm now the embodiment of the hopes for the future. And you have 6 years then to show whether you can do that. And certainly since Salinas, and I think possibly even before, sexennials have been characterized by being two-period episodes. There's a first 3 years in which you have more freedom to carry out your ambitions and show what you can do and to disrupt and demoralize your opponents. But then the second 3 years, actually, well, people are starting to think this is going to come to an end. There's going to be a successor. This in turn will be judged. Somebody will come along and will say, yes, you did some things, but I'm going to sweep you aside in turn. And by the way, in the second half of each sexennial, you have to cope with the problem of the midterm elections. So I think a lot of what's going on at present is AMLO probably going into overdrive for fear that he might not emerge as strong in the midterm elections of June 2021 as he emerged in July 2018. And he's making great efforts, and it's an open question whether those efforts will be productive or not. But the logic of the sexenio, as opposed to the logic of the Quarta Transformación, would be there's going to be a second round to this in which his room for maneuver and his time horizons are shortening, and indeed the people who he relies on and works through become more and more interested in differentiating themselves and competing to succeed him. So unless you think that the consolidation of authoritarianism in Mexico involves turning AMLO into a multi-sexennial personalist ruler, I think we have to, and personally I doubt that, I think we have to frame this in terms of a rather limited time frame, and the need to get some results that are the trademark and the achievements of the particular administration in question before the time runs out on that administration. So that's on profound transformation. Then on populism, I mean, populism is an extremely wide and popular phrase these days. Many of the things that Alberto was saying reminded me of, could have been said about Donald Trump, and some of them could have been said about Boris Johnson. But I would stress that populism comes in several different forms. And one important form of populism, if we think certainly of Echeverría, for example, is economic populism. The characteristic of economic populism is I'm in charge of the budget. I can intimidate the central bank. I can manipulate and frighten the business community and so on. And as a result of that, I can go for broke in expanding the economy. And we know that economic populism of that kind in Mexico, both in 1970 to 76 and in 76 to 82, did indeed go for broke and did indeed result in a breakage. And indeed, Salinas also ended in a breakage. The characteristic cycle of the sexenio was when the president's power fades at the end, the overuse and the abuse of economic levers results in an economic crisis, which means you move from being very powerful to being very weak and dependent. Now, if we apply that aspect of populism, economic populism, to López Obrador, what we see is actually, despite all the rhetoric against neoliberalism and so on, and Alberto did concede that, did recognize this, AMLO is not an Echeverría by any means at all. He's going, even in conditions where most economists, even quite conservative economists, would say you need to undertake deficit spending, you need to be willing to loosen the monetary spigots, you need to be in some form or other capturing the economic surplus. He has not been doing that. He has been pursuing a policy of extraordinary austerity. And you might have thought that Echeverría started off with austerity and then reacted against it because his 6 years were going to run out and he couldn't afford to carry on with it. You might have thought that after 2 years, López Obrador would also be reacting against austerity. But that is not the case if you look at any rate at the budget for 2021. So it will be very interesting to see whether he can break the tradition of a weaker position in the midterm elections, while at the same time insisting in extremely adverse economic circumstances on being economically orthodox, not economically populist. Now, there are other aspects of populism which apply better to him, but before I turn to those, there's the accusation of nostalgia. He wants to go back to the old ways. Now, I think here it's quite important to look at the difference between López Obrador's policies inside Mexico and López Obrador's administration's relationship with the rest of the world. Above all, let's look at the relationship with the United States. It is not nostalgia to do everything you can to renegotiate NAFTA, making concessions to the United States in order to keep it afloat, with the implication actually that your basic long-run economic legacy will be to reinforce the integration of the Mexican industrial economy into the North American industrial economy, and to reinforce the existence of a North American economic bloc, which is pitted against the Asian rising industrial interests. That's not nostalgia. That was not Echeverria. That was not the policy of the economic policy. You notice I'm stressing here economic strategy and economic policy rather more than Alberto did, because I think that's where the corrective to these terms might be most appropriate. But now let me come finally to a few points about the politics. The personalism. Undoubtedly, people describe him as Lopez Obrador as displaying messianic characteristics of appealing directly to the people, just as, for example, Cardenas built his support by going around all the backwaters of Mexico in extremely difficult traveling conditions, showing that he was present for all sorts of areas of Mexico that had been neglected. That was the technique that Lopez Obrador did to convert himself from being the mayor of Mexico City or the figure from Tabasco to being a nationwide, close to the people representative. And the morning conferences, which take up a remarkable amount of his time, I mean, it must be something like 25% of the president's working time has to be devoted to that form of communication. He also loses time on very forms of travel and all the rest of it. So insofar as he's a personalist, he hasn't got the leeway, really, to exert all the different levers of personal direct control over all the variables that he would need to be fully dominant across the political spectrum, which is why I think, even though I agree that the superdelegados are important and that the governors are intimidated and so on, you can see him, for example, going around in the last few months in his morning conferences, which he holds sometimes in state capitals. There he is with the state governor side by side. And some of those state governors have been quite effective, both in extracting benefits from him because he's there on their stamping ground and he has to explain why the metro in Guadalajara hasn't been built or whatever it is, or indeed even in terms of upstaging him in personal positioning, in showing themselves in dissent. Of course, as you know, there are 10 state governors who are in the Alianza Federalista, who are, in a sense, just a bit like, mayors in England. They're standing up against the overwhelming manifestations of strength from the Prime Minister, and in the course of that, they're winning a certain degree of political credibility locally. So I think there are a number of things about the personalism that we could discuss. Finally, statism. And again, Alberto recognized this, but I want to highlight it. The Mexican state is in a very weak position. Take, for example, the question of the rule of law. If you want to punish anybody for any malfeasance, and you want a proper inquiry and a proper legal process about it, you have to have them prosecuted in the United States. The courts and the legal processes in Mexico are not credible, are not just, and are in fact not even going after the most obvious and spectacular abusers of state power. So statism with a very weak legal system, statism also with a very reduced budget, with the national budget, federal budget, with very limited leverage, and everything that López Obrador has been doing in terms of setting limits on salaries for public employees, for example, and on dismantling the fideicomisos, which happened today, etc., has the effect of weakening the state apparatus further. And that's the instrument through which he would have to be a statist. Now, it's true that he is in alliance, for the time being at any rate, with Manuel Bartlett, who is a statist in the sense that he sees himself as the mafia boss of the electricity sector, and he has no intention of allowing any of the surplus in that state enterprise to be captured by those who do not have his approval. So that's a form of statism, if you like, but it's an extremely parasitic. It's basically more like state capture than statism. And of course, I don't need to stress the extreme gravity, as Alberto mentioned, of the organized crime challenge. I mean, if this is statism, what do you make of the fact that the cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación can, in the center of Mexico City, almost succeed in assassinating the head of the Mexico City police force, and almost certainly was doing that as part of an intercartel rivalry rather than anything else. And finally, then on top of all that comes COVID. Well, if you're a statist, the state of the health service would be one of the things that you would need to organize through the public sector. And of course, watching the pathetic spectacle, even today I was watching the López-Gatell, the health minister in the Mañanera, trying to talk his way out of the fact that none of his charts and none of his indications of health planning and control are exercising any purchase over the reality of that tremendous pandemic. López Obrador gambled heavily on Trump winning the presidency. He's gambled heavily on a number of other doubtful propositions. At present, he's still popular, although his party is much less popular than him. But I'm not at all sure that there's going to be a Cuarta Transformación, or even going to be the completion of a sexenio, which is regarded as a transformative administration.
Thank you, Laurence. You have again given us a lot to think about. I'd like to focus my own remarks very briefly on the politics of AMLO and the Fourth Transformation. And over the past 2 years, many observers have been somewhat surprised by the political course that AMLO has set, not so much by his populist style per se, but by his focused and persistent attacks on Mexico's institutions of political accountability, ranging from the Supreme Court to non-governmental organizations, to the mainstream media, to the National Electoral Institute, INE, and so forth. I'm not so sure they should have been all that surprised. After all, AMLO was socialized under the left populist Luis Echeverria, who was president between 1970 and 1976, and he came of political age in Mexico's traditions of revolutionary nationalism and political legitimacy by results rather than by process or procedure were fully intact. AMLO taps into those deep currents in Mexican political culture, what Alberto in another context is referred to as nostalgic populism. Even though he may envision himself as a 21st century Benito Juarez, what he carries really is the DNA of the old Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI, and with the apparent goal of recreating the PRI's hegemony in Morena form, with all of the limits and caveats that Alberto identified. I think two currents in AMLO's record really illustrate this point. The first, as both Alberto and Laurence have noted, is his single-minded effort to centralize political authority and concentrate discretionary power in the president, or more specifically, in the hands of the president. This rose back against the most consequential and successful changes produced by Mexico's democratization experience over the past 2 decades. But to my mind, it goes to the heart of what post-revolutionary authoritarianism in Mexico was all about. One key mechanism that AMLO has repeatedly used are popular referenda, that almost always generate claimed public support for what AMLO wants to do personally. And of course, one of the much discussed early examples of this was his cancellation of the construction projects or construction contracts at considerable public expense for the new Mexico City International Airport. AMLO's political message at the time, which was clearly understood, especially by the private sector, was "Aquí mando yo," I'm now in control. In his first 2 years, AMLO has quite systematically questioned and undercut the authority of institutions that might constrain executive power: the Supreme Court, the INE, many decentralized agencies, and so forth. His weapon has been the budget, justifying quite radical budgetary cuts on the grounds that so-called Republican austerity is necessary in a country marked by great social inequality and extreme poverty. But the threat of repeated budgetary cuts has been enough to make the heads of many institutions act much more cautiously and withhold criticism of AMLO and his agenda. Second, AMLO has consistently promoted a bipolar vision of contemporary politics. Either people or groups are for me or for him and for the fourth transformation, or against him and against the 4T. That too, I think, harkbacks to the early decades of the early decades after the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920, when political forces were either for or against the revolution. That was the original and explicit justification for Plutarco Elias Calles pulling almost all political forces into the fledgling National Revolutionary Party, or the predecessor of the PRI. And it is what AMLO would like to promote for Morena. Two examples here, I think, are quite illustrative. The first, and I think Alberto made brief reference to this, was AMLO's surprising and politically unnecessary attacks on the anti-feminicide women's protests in February and March of this year. And the second example would be his recent push to investigate all of his neoliberal presidential predecessors for corruption, abuse of authority, and even their actions once they left office. Let me expand just a bit on this second gambit. The September legislative initiative that AMLO proposed called for organizing a popular referendum on whether to investigate all his predecessors, whether from the PRI or the National Action Party, the PAN, going back to Carlos Salinas de Gortari in 1988. These are all the presidents who, according to AMLO, are responsible for the horrors of neoliberalism in Mexico. Each article of the original initiative addressed the alleged failures and crimes of an individual president. For example, it noted that under Salinas, the number of Forbes list billionaires in Mexico jumped from 2 to 24. Salinas' successor, Ernesto Zedillo, was responsible for the government-financed Fobaproa bailout of the Mexican private sector and the losses they had suffered during the 1994-95 financial crisis. something that AMLO roundly condemned at the time. And for Vicente Fox, the quite accurate charge in the initiative was that he had maneuvered hard to defeat AMLO in his first presidential race in 2006. Indeed, the initiative actually quoted Fox himself as later saying that he had tried to, quote unquote, load the dice against AMLO and so forth. In undertaking this initiative, AMLO is, of course, confronting the entrenched Mexican tradition that former presidents are de facto exempt from investigation. It may also be reneging on what was credibly reported in June 2018 as AMLO's private deal with then President Peña Nieto, that in exchange for Peña Nieto not interfering in any way in the final stages of the presidential election campaign, that AMLO would exempt any future corruption investigation or would avoid any future corruption investigation of both Peña Nieto and ex-Pemex director Emilio Lozoya. By asking for popular endorsement to investigate all his predecessors going back to 1988, is AMLO really willing to throw all the plates into the air and see where they might fall? Or is he simply seeking political cover to pursue Peña Nieto and the members of his notoriously corrupt government? One conjecture is that the timing of the referendum to coincide with the 2021 midterm elections is simply designed to defend Morena against predictable electoral losses at the midterm. However, that goal may have been undercut somewhat by the Supreme Court, which approved the referendum but radically altered the wording of the question, eliminating all reference to ex-presidents, their individual names, what they did during and after leaving office, and so forth. It's now quite an innocuous referendum question, which by July 2021, many voters may not recall or really see the importance or relevance of. Just to conclude, as many analysts have noted, AMLO's ability to pursue these initiatives rests on a fundamental political reality, and that is the current weakness of all the opposition parties. The underlying logic of much of what he is doing is simply to keep his political rivals, all of them, weak and divided. And so far, at least, that seems to be working. And I'll stop on that note, and with Alberto and Laurence, open the floor for discussion from any of our virtual audience.